Hello and welcome to this series on supplements and athletics. My name is Nandor, and the purpose of this presentation, but not just this presentation, I intend to actually make a few. In any event, is going to be on supplements, or actually rather looking at supplements of the many hundreds or thousands that are available. The maybe top 4, 5, or 6 that actually have a effect at a reasonable dose that can be used either by athletic population, of course that would be my primary focus, but also possibly other populations, special populations, maybe such as elderly or people with certain disabilities, in a productive way. Now, as a small disclaimer, a lot of these slides will be borrowed, so to say, from past graduate or undergraduate classes that I have taken. So I will do my best to credit the professors who provided these slides. So for this presentation, I will be utilizing work from Dr. Zordos and Dr. Hong. Now, the easiest supplement to probably start with is creatine, because as we will get to, there is a very, very extensive body of research that supports creatine as an extremely effective supplement. It's not really debatable, but regardless, we'll look at it. So the format I will follow here is going to be more or less the same in every of the other presentations. So first I will do a basic overview of what this supplement is, then how it works. Then we'll look at what the research says, then dosing or loading if applicable, and then finally some sort of conclusion as to if it's effective and in what way it might be effective or what sports. So as I mentioned, creatine is a pretty old supplement that has been around a long time. It was discovered back in 1832 as a component of skeletal muscle, and it is transported through the blood for usage by muscle. So specifically over the past 20 years, as sports nutrition has increased or become more popular or more significant component of athletic performance, creatine has turned out to be the most researched supplement on the market, and also with the most robust effects. So just a little background on creatine. It is non-essential. Non-essential because it can be synthesized in liver and kidney, and it is manufactured from arginine, glycine, and methionine, which are amino acids, and then can then be taken up by tissues that demand high energy. For instance, skeletal muscle during exercise. I will cover a little bit more in detail how this goes exactly, but basically by supplementing creatine, the PCR or phosphocreatine stores in skeletal muscle increases, and this is utilized to buffer or replenish ATP. So creatine would be classified as a non-protein. Its primary role is anabolic, and it's anaerobic. And the mode of action, or basically how it acts, is, as I mentioned earlier, it's an ATP buffer, which I will once again go through in detail what exactly that means. And there are other mechanisms through which it might act, and there are conflicting evidence and studies and so forth, but it might possibly positively affect satellite cell activity, and also initiate IGF pathways. IGF pathways, by the way, are essential for muscle protein synthesis. It might affect myostatin, which with age becomes a player in restricting satellite cell activity. And of course it's also a H plus buffer or hydrogen buffer, which it does through creatine kinase, through buffering creatine kinase, which is also a marker of muscle damage. Overall, it's before looking at the evidence, I will suggest that it is its efficacy grade, if we were to give it one, would be an A. So it is very, very effective. This is mainly because there is a huge amount of evidence on humans. We will look at some meta-analyses in older and younger and athletic populations and so forth. It is also very safe. There are really no studies that go against creatine, showing that it is unsafe or dangerous in any shape, way, or form on a healthy population. Also, creatine is very cheap. Probably one can buy a kilogram even for around $10 if it's just in its pure form, which is called creatine monohydrate, unflavored. It's very cheap stuff. And it is effective on a variety of populations, which we'll also cover, not just athletes. So before moving on exactly how this works, it is very important to understand, and I'll probably spend maybe just a little bit of time on this, the energy systems of the human body, because this will determine how effective a supplement is. And this is also where, not just in supplementation, in training as well, there's a lot of confusion, but certainly in supplementation. So basically the body has three major energy systems. The two are anaerobic and one is aerobic. So the anaerobic ones is the ATP-PCR, it is called. It's immediate energy, ATP, phosphocreatine, high energy phosphates. There are all sorts of names for it. Then there is a non-oxidative system which is called fast glycolysis, utilizing glucose. These are anaerobic, so basically they do not require oxygen. And then there is, of course, the aerobic one, which is also called oxidative phosphorylation. Now we will focus, of course, for the purpose of creatine, on the ATP-PCR. It is, however, completely essential, I do have to point this out, that the supplement is tested with respect to the correct system. So as a very easy example, if creatine affects the topmost system, ATP-PCR, and we start testing it in endurance sports, then that probably will not work very well. And this can often be seen in poorly designed studies where something like arginine or citrulline or something like that will be tested in a 1 rep max squat, which would be not the smartest, right? Because it is the wrong system. So anyways, very briefly, ATP-PCR, it's effective for anything power, 0 to 10 seconds, maybe 14, like weightlifting. It does not involve oxygen, as I mentioned, and ATP is the immediate source of energy. And I will go through the three components of the ATP-PCR. So there are basically three ways in which this ATP-PCR, this immediate energy system, can work. The first and most immediate one is ATP hydrolysis, and that's just basically the breakdown of ATP, the breaking of a phosphate bond through the ATPase enzyme, which then yields essentially ADP, which stands for adenosine diphosphate. It's just one phosphate less, which is the extra PI actually, that's inorganic phosphate plus energy. Now, when this happens, then the amount of ATP diminishes and ADP increases. And this kind of brings us to the second one, the phosphocreatine system, which is a second source of cellular energy. And this is where creatine comes in, or creatine supplementation. As we can see in that little figure on the bottom, we see the PCR, that's the phosphocreatine or creatine phosphate, whatever you want to call it, that will combine with ADP, which was created in the first point, the ATP hydrolysis, and catalyzed by creatine kinase enzyme will form an ATP. So it will replenish that ATP, and then step one can be repeated. Now the available amounts of energy through PCR is about 5 to 6 times that of just ATP standing around. And finally, there's also a third system being through the myokinase enzyme, which basically takes 2 ADP and through this catalyzed by myokinase forms 1 ATP and 1 AMP. Now, this system can generate about 11.1 or about 11 kilocalories per mole in this is assuming a 70 kilogram male with 30 kilograms of muscle. I guess the Western man has changed a little bit over the past few years since this was initially made. But to put that into perspective, that's kind of what is that sprint of 10 to 14 seconds. It would be the energy, right? So just as an overview, what each of these three systems give. The first one, the ATP hydrolysis, only 1.8 kilocal per mole in a normal 70 kilogram man. The PCR about 8.4, and the myokinase about 0.9, the least. So if we look at this, it kind of makes sense that if we can increase the amount of creatine stored, then we can increase this PCR store, and hence affect the most significant component of this energy system. And this is exactly the idea behind creatine supplementation. So essentially, when ATP is reduced to either of the components that we took a look at up there, I mean, at some point there will be ADP, then that PCR can donate phosphate and replenish ATP. So it will make a lot of sense to invest into that creatine, increase the amount stored, and hence increase the body's ability to buffer ATP. Finally, to really drive this point home, we can look at this little graph where we see how ATP and phosphocreatine interacts with respect to time. So once again, as a sprint is, in this case it's a sprint, but it will be similar if you were to do a few reps of some heavy squats or deadlifts or any kind of high intensity exercise. It really would that would start eating up the ATP in muscle. Of course, anything high intensity would, or any intensity for that matter. And then, given that is this system that is hit, then the phosphocreatine would start replenishing ATP, and ATP would be maintained as long as the phosphocreatine is also maintained. Of course, eventually, as phosphocreatine drops and ATP drops, then exhaustion ensues. So to be noted as a little side note, and we will get more into this, but the recovery time for ATP is about 3 to 5 minutes, more or less complete recovery for 5 minutes, and for PCR is about 8 minutes. I think this is according to the National Strength and Conditioning Association's research.